You are listening to another Discovering New Horizons for America podcast featuring Dr. Jim Polakof. As always, each podcast episode is a search for the truth and how it applies to our daily lives and well-being. Dr. Jim's guest for this episode is Rob Richie, co-founder of Fair Vote. If you've ever felt there could be a better system for elections in America, this episode is for you. Now, to take you on a search for the truth and an exciting New Horizons journey is our host, Dr. Jim Polakof.
This is Dr. Jim Polakof, and I want to thank my followers for joining me once again. And also welcome to those who are accessing my podcast for the first time. Hopefully you're going to enjoy this particular episode. I think it's going to be a good one because it has to do with your voting rights. Together, we'll be discovering the advantages of ranked choice voting compared to the current method of electing candidates for our office. The primary objective is to make voting more fair. Thus, the name of the organization, Fair Vote. My guest is Rob Richie, who has been the leader of Fair Vote as a co-founder for some 30 years, and he currently serves as its president and CEO. Mr. Richie is a frequent media resource on MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN, and NPR's All Things Considered. His writings have appeared in every major national publication, including the New York Times and Washington Post, as well as 11 books, including Every Vote Equal. Welcome, Rob Richie. And it's good to have you, and it's good to finally get around to voting the fair way.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, James. And it's lot going on. There'll be a lot to talk about.
Well, I think so. We have a lot of ground to cover for sure. You were recently quoted in an article, and I'd like to phrase that quote, I should say. You said, "These are the best of times and the worst of times." Now, I believe you were talking about congressional dysfunction, if I'm right, and how this makes a case for proportional representation. Perhaps you can explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, I won't take credit for the phrase from Charles Dickens, but it is one that relates to, I think, a reformer gets the most attention when there are accidents, in a sense, in front of us, ready to be reformed. And, for someone like myself, I believe that, I've done this now half of my life, since I was in my 20s and 30 years ago. And I've always believed that there's really important reasons to have the conversation that we've been trying to get going about changing our electoral system to be fair for all voters. And now the whole country, in a sense, is having more of that conversation and seeing the intensity of the polarization, seeing the outcomes for how difficult it is to get, basic things done, and for, risks to the sense of people's trust in our democracy itself. And I think it's creating the awareness that we should talk about what might be the incentives that are driving people the wrong direction, first principles, and connecting to the fact that we live in this unusual country as far as where change can happen, because we can really do a lot of changes from the bottom up. A lot of countries, it has to be very top down. The United States is one where these conversations can happen in communities, counties, states, of course, in Congress, but it's something where it's a meaningful chance for us to look at what we can do wherever we are.
It's beginning with the grassroots. So let's get to the primary objective of your organization, Fair Vote. Exactly how do you describe ranked choice voting so our audience has a better picture of, I guess it's also called RCV?
Yeah, RCV, instant runoff voting, is a phrase that's been used to describe it. It's a system that takes the traditional way we think of the ballot, where you have a set of candidates and you just get to not note your support for one of them and not say anything about everyone else. This is when you essentially get to hedge your bets and to create incentives for the candidates to talk to more voters and voters to learn about more candidates. So instead of just ticking one, you get to say who your preferences are, who your first choice is, who your second choice is, who your third choice is. You can stop with one preference. You can rank them all. It's up to you. But the principle is you're trying to get a candidate who can assemble and win a majority against the other strongest candidate, no matter how many people run. If only two people run, when you vote for one of them, then one of them is going to get more than half the votes, and that's it. But in our current system, when you can only vote for one and like 3 or 4 people run, or 5 or 6, the top candidate might only get 30% or 25% or something a lot less than half the votes. And yet we might just have that person win, even though a majority of people might really dislike that person. But the idea of a ranked choice voting system is to, going to its other name, create an instant runoff where you're essentially getting the 2 candidates compared head to head, the top 2 candidates. And you do that by counting all the first choices, see if you get a majority winner outright. If so, that's it. If not, the candidate in last place, one of the fewest votes, is out. In their ballots, you examine them, count them for their second choice, rinse and, see if you got a majority winner. If not, kind of rinse and repeat and sort of go until you get someone with more than half the votes.
But I think part of the problem is, correct me if I'm wrong, but under our current system, if someone's running in a primary, for example, and whatever candidate wins the primary, either Republican, Democrat, whatever it might be, or whoever it might be, then the problem is that that's a minority vote. And when the general election takes place, people don't have the opportunity to really choose the candidate that they want. They have to choose whoever's left, correct?
Correct. And there's sort of one of the byproducts. So that's one byproduct, which is that if more than 2 people run, you can have someone win who is not a representative candidate and doesn't even try to be, because that's part of it. You're trying to create virtuous incentives to try to be a majority candidate or try to get as many votes as possible. But it also means, because of the system, if you challenge that and say in a general election where you've got a Democrat, Republican, and maybe a third party or an independent runs, because you can only vote for one, our system just doesn't accommodate that well, right? And you get a whole conversation about that's a split vote, you have a spoiler. So it coerces a kind of 2-choice system, which then in turn makes that primary all the more important, twinned with the fact that the great majority of districts in this country, great majority of states at this point are kind of locked in for Democrats or Republicans.
Right. And
the general election doesn't really matter when it's just down to one versus the other. And so then the primary becomes everything, right? And so we're in a system, and what the system has created is one where Democrats and Republicans are both being more and more responsive to whoever turns out in the primary, and they're scared of each other, and they're like really worried if the other side takes power, it's going to be sort of existentially a threat to them. And so it just drives an attitude of wanting their side to be a fighter and to be like stop the other people. And so it just is creating this dynamic where, we end up with representatives that have a lot of trouble working together.
Well, and of course, the nice thing about RCV is the fact that you do get a second choice. So if you choose someone that you really feel I'm in favor of this candidate, but if this candidate doesn't win, this is the second candidate I would like to see. And that gives you a second choice rather than just be locked into that same position, correct?
Exactly. And the candidates know that. So they know they start talking to more people, because they say, oh, it's important to get first choices, but I also need to be attentive to being the second choice of these other voters. And in a primary, where you might have 5, 6 people running, it means, you are talking to more voters and you're trying to make connections, and you're sort of, the voters can kind of hedge their bets, and it's just not as all or nothing as it is now. And then you translate it in the general election, and an independent or third party candidate is no longer a spoiler. They can put their best foot forward and sort of hold the major parties accountable. Still going to be hard to win, but they at least can create an alternative voice and an alternative check on kind of parties not being very representative, which right now there's not much of a general election check if they're not being actually particularly represented.
That's very true. And I, correct me again if I happen to be wrong about this, but in Alaska, for example, and I don't know if that was part of your operation, but in Alaska, there were almost like 25 candidates running for that office, if I remember correctly, for the House of Representatives.
Yeah, that special election.
There more than one choice.
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting. Yeah, so they have a particular approach. One thing I should say, ranked choice voting, one way to think of it is it's an instrument that can be played in different ways, right? It's a ballot type and a ballot sort of a principle of hedging your bets, first choice, second choice is a backup, but you can use it as a form of proportional representation, a proportional voting system. You can combine it with open primaries. You can use it for very limited uses like they do in Georgia and South Carolina, states on either side of or near you, where just the military and overseas voters use the ranked choice ballot to make sure their vote has a chance to count in runoffs, because it's so hard to get them runoff ballots separately. Anyway, there's a lot of different ways to do it. The Alaska system is really interesting. It is actually a fair vote proposal from years ago. It's sort of a way that if you want to do an open primary system, the way they have it in California. So California, Washington, a couple other states have a ballot where everyone just runs together in a single ballot. So in the primary, you don't separate the parties out. It's just everyone on the same ballot. And the way they do it in Washington, California is you vote for one of them and the top two candidates advance. And, one might have 36 and the next one 23, and they might be both Democrats or they might be both Republicans or whatever. And those are the only two people that advance. What Alaska does is something that we think is better. It creates more general election choice because it advances 4. And then there's 4 people on that general election ballot. Same principle otherwise, very open ballot. You vote for one, top 4 advance. And then
So
because you have
do we vote 1 through 4? In other words, can you have 4 choices or you just have 2
you just
choices?
vote for one. It's just kind of like the same ballot that they use in California, except 4 people advance. But in the general election, because you now have more than 2, they use ranked choice voting to handle having more than 2 choices. So that's what they did in Alaska. And when this member of Congress had been there for 50 years, Don Young had been there since the early 70s, and he died all of a sudden about a year ago. And so they had to have a special election, and a whole bunch of people jumped in because it's like, wow, special election, that's fun. So it was actually more than 40 candidates.
Oh.
And but they voted for one, and then the top 4 advanced. The most famous person was Sarah Palin, who had been former governor and vice presidential candidate. But there were a mix of other people. And so the general election ballot, or, for this special election, ended up having a couple of Republicans and a Democrat and an independent who dropped out. So then it was just 3, the Democrat and 2 Republicans. And then they used ranked choice voting. And it's fascinating for kind of like opening up the ballot, opening up a conversation. Sarah Palin was a strong candidate, but it turned out that she had a pretty high rate of unfavorable ratings in Alaska, as well as
many people who did not like her now had a chance to certainly have backup, so to speak.
Have some options. And she didn't really respond well to that opportunity, and she ended up losing to the Democrat, who's a native Alaskan. Since she won, has actually hired the former Republican, Don Young, the Republican member's staff. Essentially, she's trying to kind of like be a pretty much in the center kind of Alaskan, and fascinating woman, a woman named Mary Patola, and she kind of arose out of this very open system. Like a year ago, before Don Young died, if someone had said who might be the next member of Congress from Alaska, no one would have said Mary Patola. But she sort of came out of this very, very open process and really handled the ballot well and building a majority, and is now actually the single most popular politician in Alaska. We'll see how long that lasts, because it's hard to stay popular as a politician. But
yeah, exactly.
Anyway, the system certainly put her in a good opportunity. She didn't have to run a single negative campaign. She didn't run a single negative ad her whole campaign.
And that is exactly the question I'm getting to next, because perhaps the thing that bothers me most, and I'm sure most Americans, is the negative campaigning that's been going on, and it's getting worse. It's not getting any better. There are more and more negative ads, just absolutely inundating the airways, particularly on television. So how does RCV help in terms of quelling this negative campaigning?
Well, it changes incentives. You can't change behavior. You can't force candidates to respond to the incentives, but it does change them. So when you only have a single choice, and let's say you only have a head-to-head contest, A versus B, Democrat versus Republican, and you're on one side, basically, if you can make the other side look bad, you're the only alternative, right? So a lot of the negative campaigning comes from that basic fact. I want to make the other side look bad. I want my side to be scared and mobilized. We need to get fired up because that other side is terrible, right? So you sort of have an incentive to drive your vote up from your base, drive down the base of support for the other side and hopefully get some swing votes. And negative ads work. That's why they do them. And in any kind of single choice system, when it's all or nothing, if you're not going to get the vote from a voter, you might as well go negative about their supporters, right? But ranked choice voting, you suddenly might be benefited from being their second choice or their third choice.
Exactly. So you don't want to antagonize too many people, because it may be the difference between winning and losing. Therefore, you sort of calm things down a bit, realizing you can't say too many bad things about an opponent.
Exactly. And at least be civil about it, right? At least express your differences in a respectful way, right? And if you open the ballot up, so if you open the ballot up to more than two choices, and second and third choices might make the difference, you suddenly have really changed incentives.
So out of curiosity with RCV, I know there are so many different states, and you had mentioned California and Washington have a different system than, for example, Alaska, as far as ranked choice voting. Is your program, ranked choice voting, the way that Fair Vote does it? Is it pretty much the same for every state? Or in other cases, is it different where you perhaps you're not able to vote for more than one additional candidate?
Yeah, Fair Vote over the years has basically had the principle of like, how do we make more votes count? How do we make more voters respected? And so we've done things to help more people get registered to vote, and keep the rolls kind of clean and full. We've looked at changes to redistricting and so on. The ranked choice ballot has been a consistent principle of support because we think it just gives more power to us as voters and changes incentives for the candidates. And as I was saying, it's an instrument that can be played differently. And so we support it in a mix of ways of using it. The most ambitious, exciting one, which we'll get into later, is the idea of combining it with a change in how many representatives elect us. And in Congress, there's a bill called the Fair Representation Act. So that's
right. Now I do want to get into that, but
and that's one way of using ranked choice voting. Right. A version of that kind of passed in the city of Portland, Oregon this past fall, and they're going to use basically that approach to ranked choice voting. You've got the Alaska system, which combines it with the primary change that they have in California and Washington. California and Washington don't have ranked choice voting, but they have the open primary ballot. So you can have some changes without another. But ranked choice voting also is passed in Maine. And in Maine, they don't change the primary system. They have primaries with ranked choice voting. And so now you use ranked choice voting in a Democratic primary, in the Republican primary. If there was a minor party primary, they would use it there also. And then you win a nomination, but now you have to, get more votes to win the nomination. And then they use it in the general election. And Maine is a history, like Alaska, actually, of having a lot of independents and third parties run on the general election ballot. So it really makes a difference on that general election ballot too. So the
voter really has more choices. That's what it boils down to in Maine and in Alaska.
Yep. They use it for presidential primaries in Maine. They use it for the presidential election. So there's these different ways. The idea of using it presidential primaries is really taking on, like, just as a standalone use of it, because a lot of people run for president these days. As people may remember, there were 20 Democrats on the stage early on in 2019, 2020, and then there were about 15 Republicans that ran in 2016, and they're going to have another big field in 2024. We don't know yet about the Democrats, and
people never had a second choice. That was the problem.
Exactly.
And it may have been a whole different outcome actually if the voter would have had a second choice.
Would have been a different outcome, or could have been a different outcome, but it also would have created incentives for candidates to, be a consensus, like to try to build their party together. And I think we kind of get there by having contests, sequentially, like Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, and then they have another round every week, and that's kind of like ranked choice voting, kind of like a reality TV show where you knock off candidates every week or something like that. But ranked choice voting in every contest creates that positive incentive of needing to reach out to more people. So long and short of it is, Fair Vote works with state and local allies to advance ranked choice voting as it makes sense in that city or state. In more than 60 cities have gone to ranked choice voting in the last few years. 2 states, there's a lot of midway changes, like Hawaii last year passed ranked choice voting, but in a very limited way, just for vacancies for Congress and local elections. That's all it is. But that's important, having a quicker, faster more representative vacancy election. And, you can have a spectrum of changes that we think kind of move the ball forward for voters.
And it's also a step forward. I mean, they try this out and they seem to like it, then they expand to more of what your concept is.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find interesting is, and it makes a great deal of sense, with ranked choice voting, you can actually save money. For example, in Georgia, what have there been 3 elections in 2 years? And if you had ranked choice voting, that would have obviously made a big difference in saving that state a great deal of money.
Yes, they are the land of runoff elections. So they have primary elections that can go to a runoff, general elections that can go to a runoff. Sometimes they have a vacancy because someone leaves for Congress. They'll actually need 3 elections sometimes to fill that vacancy, a primary runoff, and a general election. So a lot of Georgia voters last year were asked to vote 4 times, both primary runoff, general election runoff. And a statewide runoff in Georgia costs the taxpayers collectively something like $75 million.
Amazing.
And the turnout declines. It just becomes much more negative. And fascinatingly, like this last one that Senator Warnock beat Herschel Walker in a runoff election for Senate. But during that election, Warnock said, I'm interested in ranked choice voting as an alternative. And the Secretary of State, who's a Republican, said he's also interested in ranked choice voting as an alternative. So they are having a conversation about it. And it is a state where their overseas voters do use an instant runoff kind of ranked choice ballot already. So it is something that there's a real conversation going on there. So in North Carolina is a state that has those runoff elections for primaries sometimes. And so I think any place that has a runoff invites a conversation about ranked choice voting as an alternative.
It makes a great deal of sense. Now, you mentioned, and this is the second time you mentioned about overseas voters and military. How does RCV actually provide an advantage for voters who are not in the country itself?
Right. So they have a challenge. We have a challenge in a sense. We of getting the ballots to them and getting them back. Like if I'm, overseas in Afghanistan or wherever, you find out who's on the ballot, you send them a ballot, and then they fill it out and return it. And voting absentee always takes time, even if you live in the same city.
They're always the last ones counted, basically.
Yeah. But if you're overseas, it just takes a lot of time. The mail is slow and so on. So the federal government has required, if there's a federal election with a runoff election, like those Georgia Senate races and the primaries and so on, that the gap between first and second round needs to be at least more than 6 weeks, 45 days. And but that's a pretty long runoff election period. And it's still actually not that great for an overseas voters to reliably make sure they get the ballot. So 6 states now actually send out a ranked choice ballot in the first when they're voting, before the runoff, or before they even know they're going to have a runoff. And so the voter returns a ballot for the regular election and then returns the second ballot that is essentially a pre-done runoff ballot where they just do the ranked ballots. They rank the candidates. And if there's a runoff, they've already indicated their preferences. And you just look at that ranked choice ballot and say, oh, your first choice didn't make the runoff, but your second choice did. So then your ballot's going to count for your second choice. Or, sorry, your first choice and your second choice didn't make the runoff, but your third choice did. And so we're going to count that one. And that allows the states that do this to have much quicker runoff elections. So South Carolina, they only have, I think, 2-week runoffs or maybe 3 weeks, but a much quicker runoff because their overseas voters have already got their votes in.
It sounds so much more efficient. One of the things that actually I noticed in your website, I believe it was stated in your website, which is fairvote.org, correct?
Yes.
All right.
Fairvote.org. And if they want to see the action side, they can go to fairvoteaction.org about what might be going on in their state.
I was going to ask you because there are 2 fair votes, one fairvote.org and then fairvote.action or fairvoteaction.org. So yes, we're going to have that on our website as well, published. But in any case, about voters who are underrepresented, I'm curious about that. Women, for example, are underrepresented often. People of color. How does ranked choice voting help in that regard?
Well, part of why some communities are underrepresented is they're kind of challenging the orthodox perception of who's a viable candidate. And if you only have one choice, it's sort of like, I better go for the candidate who I think will win or something like that. And there's sort of a psychology that, at least historically, has made it harder for people to use their one vote for kind of a new voice or something. But if you feel liberated from that, if you're like, oh, well, I have a second choice, I have a backup, I have a third choice, you start thinking about the candidates differently. You give them that second look. You give a first-time candidate a closer look, like, oh, well, I wouldn't have thought you'd be viable, but let me hear what you have to say, or something like that, right? So I'll give one very concrete example. New York City uses ranked choice voting for their primary elections now. So the biggest city in the United States, now uses RCV in primaries. And in 2021, they had a lot of open seats for the city council, actually for mayor and other offices too. But the city council was really interesting because there were 51 seats on the city council. There were only 5 women incumbents returning. And a lot of people concerned about women's representation were nervous that they might go from their 13 seats down to 5 plus a few or something like that. So there was a lot of organizing to kind of, let's get women to run. And with ranked choice voting, the voters could say, let me take a look, let me learn about them, right? And let me not prejudge who I think has the best chance to win. And when the dust settled, women went from 13 seats with only 5 returning incumbents to 31. They won 31
my
out of
goodness.
51 seats. And a majority of those, a big majority of those, were under 40 and women from communities of color, Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans. And I think a lot of it was, let me learn about these people, right? So there's something about kind of creating space for a new voice. And I think ranked choice voting really does that well.
It sounds like it. Now, we've been talking about candidates primarily at this point. How does RCV work in terms of ballot measures?
It's been very successful when you twin it to a problem that voters understand. If you just throw ranked choice voting on the ballot without context, it's still new idea to people. You have to describe it briefly on the ballot. Do you want to go to a system where you rank the candidates? And and people are like, I don't know, maybe not, or something like that. Like the first blush reaction isn't like, this is beautiful. Like 40% of people will say, I like that idea, but it's not necessary. But a lot of them will say, I'm not sure. And when you're not sure, you tend to vote no. But if it's something where they say, oh, and I'm replacing a runoff election, and that's going to save a bunch of money, or we have a history of a third-party candidate splitting votes in my state and creating outcomes that I don't feel are representative, there's some context. It does really well on the ballot. So I think of the last 25 ballot measures in cities and counties, it's won 23. So that's a really high percentage of them. And it's won on the ballot in Alaska. It had to win in Maine twice because they won it. Then the legislature tried to change it, and they put it on the ballot again to say, don't change it. And it won again. And then it lost one state in Massachusetts, and it won in Nevada last year. So it's won, actually, of the 4 states that have voted on it in the last 5 years, it's won 3 of them. So it's, again, I wouldn't think it just wins anywhere, but if you organize around for it, create an understanding of how it connects to a problem, voters then tend to say yes.
So let's talk about one of my personal pet peeves, and that has to do with gerrymandering. Obviously in states where one political party is in control, and now they can manipulate the boundaries to where their particular candidate has a better chance of winning. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, I know you mentioned it briefly previously, but let's get into that. Can you give us an example how RCV would help there?
Well, it starts with the fact that kind of like our problem with the single choice ballot compared to ranked choice voting, where you only get one choice. In a lot of our elections in the United States, you only have one representative, right? And here we are representing diverse perspectives and different views who might all live in the same neighborhood or the same county, but only one person represents that collection. And you're already kind of you're already limiting what representation means because only one person does it. But that's what we generally do in the United States. And so you have this one person, and what they run in that district is not is not a simple thought, like, oh, well, they're running in the district, but the districts are always created. They're always created by somebody. And these days they're created with great intent and focus to engineer certain outcomes. And you can do it in different ways. You can protect an incumbent by giving them a safe district. You can try to hurt an incumbent by making them a harder district for them. But generally, it's trying to help your party and hurt the other party. And we see a whole lot of that. And we're also seeing more and more voters who very consistently just vote for one party or the other. They may not love the party they vote for, but they don't like the other side, or they have a preference. So fewer and fewer people split their tickets, meaning they vote for a Democrat in this office and a Republican for another. And so you can pretty reliably start placing voters and say, oh, I have created a majority that's safe for that party because most of those people I know are going to vote for a Republican or a Democrat. And so then the general election doesn't really matter, right? And we are at a point of historic lows where state legislative and congressional races are competitive in the general election. And a lot of it is gerrymandering. A lot of it is just that sense of polarized voting patterns, and the fact that geography doesn't place people equally, right? You generally have Republican states, Republican or Democratic states, Republican districts, Democratic districts. But then when you add into it the chance to hone it and correct a competitive district to make it less competitive or whatever. So we just went through a redistricting cycle, which actually usually creates more competition just because it creates churn and difference. And in fact, we didn't. It was a very overall non-competitive election, district by district. Of course, there was a control for the House of Representatives, but it's like trench warfare. It's over just this really small number of districts. And so that's where we are now. States do it differently. Not all states have the same regime. There's been improvements in a number of states in how the lines are drawn, but it's all relative. At the
Doesn't
end of the
this
day,
give the independent candidate also a little bit of a better opportunity?
and it doesn't come out of single member districts really in any form or another, right? It's like, yeah, it's really hard in a winner take all.
But I mean, if you have RCV, you're going to basically, the independent is going to have a little bit of a better opportunity to be heard and seen and understood.
Absolutely. No, when you add in RCV and you add in multi-member districts, you really start changing the dynamic. So without those, it's really hard to create space, for the independent and for, kind of encouraging voters, or basically giving voters a chance to participate in legislative elections, for congressional elections. The People's House, we want people to feel connected to Congress, the People's House, and a lot of people really don't feel particularly they're not in a race that really matters. So if you do ranked choice voting the way we've been talking about so far, that really helps. But if you do another step, this is where it really becomes transformative. So I'll talk about the Fair Representation Act.
And I was just about to ask about the Fair Representation Act.
So you have this problem of like single districts, one person representing everyone. So the first step you need to do is to do what actually we've done in a lot of local elections. Some states, actually my state of Maryland, in the state legislature, I have 3 House members, not just one. And there's a history of that. Actually, 50, 60 years ago, we still had, most states had multi-member districts, more than one representative per area than just one. So that's step one. Step two is to put a ranked choice ballot. So you rank them in a ranked choice system. This, by the way, is just passed in Portland, Oregon, with about 60%. It's going to be the way they elect their city council. It has really an interesting history of use at the city level. If you apply it to the federal level, it's remarkable for what it does. So you would say you would take a district, a state like Massachusetts has 9 seats. Democrats have actually not lost a seat for Congress in Massachusetts in almost 30 years. So there are Republicans in Massachusetts, but they never win one of the districts, or haven't since the early 90s. And with this system, you would go from 9 one-seat districts to 3 three-seat districts. So you would have still 9 people, but you'd have fewer districts, each with 3. So that would be step one. Step two, use ranked choice voting. So you get to rank them and you look at the candidates running. And the goal now is to have as many voters as possible help elect someone. That's sort of the principle behind a ranked choice ballot. And when you're having 3 people win, you can actually have most people their ballot count toward representation. The math of it works that it's actually more than 3 out of 4 voters can mathematically be sure of helping to elect someone. And
So
that
rather than no representation for their own particular belief or party, you now have an opportunity to have a more fair representation.
absolutely, that's why it's the Fair Representation Act. And interestingly, like in Massachusetts, none of those 3-member districts would no longer would be all Democratic. You would have a Republican or an independent or a third party almost certainly winning one of the 3 seats. Democrats could try to win all 3, but they don't have more than 75% of the vote. And so you'd likely open up the representation. And similarly,
and vice versa, obviously, in areas
versa,
where Republican strongholds and Democrats don't have a voice. So it works both ways.
Works both ways. It's party neutral, but it's equal. It really levels the playing field and puts voters. And fascinatingly, every single voter in every state that has at least 3 House members would live in a district where their vote would be in a contested election, competitive election, and almost everyone would almost certainly end up being represented by a Democrat and a Republican, or 3 Democrats and a Republican, or whatever the math is, and an independent third party would have a different chance. And the same principle of ranked choice voting, there's no spoilers, there's no split votes. The incentives are the candidates to reach out to more people. And it really is, when you think about polarization and sort of having an impact on that, if you think about members, when they come back to the parades and they're, back in their district, there's a member of another party who's right in the car behind them on the parade or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually have to do some things together to serve the needs of their district. And you as a voter can say, well, I don't really want to go to that candidate, that representative. I don't feel aligned with them, but there's someone else I do feel kind of aligned to, and that's the person that I can reach out to. And so you just kind of change incentives, change representation patterns. And I think Congress would operate in a very kind of more like the way we'd wish it did, which is where they actually have some reasons to get some stuff done together.
Well, it makes a great deal of sense, but I want to be clear with my audience, and that is, unfortunately, it has not passed Congress, correct?
Correct. It is
all right. So it's still
it can pass
there,
as a bill,
but
yeah. So it's the Fair Representation Act is a proposal, but it can be done by statute. So theoretically, Congress could pass a bill and put this in it. Now, it's changing the way that they run and win. They have to find some reasons for it, but that's where what I said, the best of times, worst of times. They are operating in a climate that actually isn't great for them either, right?
Right. How is this going to happen in today's House of Representatives, where it is so deeply divided and both parties are looking for ways to obviously support their own agendas? They are so much in conflict. I would imagine that would it be a better way to go if you were doing this as an amendment, for example, to the Constitution? Well,
amendments have to actually start in Congress also. They need a 2/3 vote in Congress. This actually just needs a majority vote in Congress. And here's the thing, it wouldn't pass tomorrow if you just put it on a floor vote, but it would have some support. It has, I know 10 members have sponsored it and more would likely vote for it. But there's more of a conversation about the problem, because actually a lot of members do want to get some stuff done up there, right? And they're going to go through, like, these next 2 years could be pretty painful for getting stuff done. And I think it's that audience of, it's sort of like we got elected to do some work for the people, and let me hear more about this. And I think one thing that's true about the Fair Representation Act is it puts everyone on an equal footing. Like, it means everyone would have this new regime in place. And so it's not picking favorites or anything. It's just kind of like a new regime. Also, though, because of this bottoms-up laboratories of democracy concept we talked about earlier too, we can be working down at the local level, passing it in more cities, start having conversations about it in states. This is something I would expect within 5 years will be on a ballot somewhere for a state legislature. And let's get a model out there, show how it works. And I think, twinned with what we're seeing in Congress as far as the challenges we're facing as a nation, and essentially the lack of alternatives that really work without going to this bold step, I think will create a conversation that we can step into. And it has, because a lot of more people win with it, at the end of the day, you can make a case that to people like, you will be a winner in the system and actually be accurate, right? And so that's the big bold idea, but it's one that it defines where we want to go nationally, but it doesn't limit what we can do in the interim.
Well, it makes a great deal of sense to start at the grassroots level, to actually do it in local communities, and then hopefully you go from there to state legislatures. And then, of course, when Congress sees how popular it is among voters, and that's why it's so important to be involved. But when Congress sees it's working with voters now, suddenly they realize they've got to get on board the ship. So now I understand 2022 was a great year for your Fair Vote organization. More than 100 elections in the country used ranked choice voting. 3 million Americans had access to RCV ballots, correct? I'd like to hear more about your successes. Perhaps you can outline it so we can see that this is moving forward for you.
Yeah, so it was a really fun year. It's sort of like every other year in state legislatures is a little quieter than the odd year. So the even years, it's like election year, and they're sort of shorter sessions and so on. But we still had almost 25 states with bills, and 6 states passed something that advanced the ranked choice ballot to some degree, like that Hawaii vacancy bill. We had couple localities just passed RCV straight, which they didn't need to put it to the voters. So Arlington County, which is right across the river from DC here in Virginia, went to ranked choice voting. A city in Oregon did just that way. It was on the ballot in 10 jurisdictions and won 8. And it won in seven cities and counties, including the biggest cities in Oregon and Washington State. And it's won in Nevada. It has to win again in Nevada to put that Alaska-style system in. But that's the opportunity that we have to build to another statewide win in Nevada. And it had a conversation in Congress. Actually, the Democrats almost put it in for their caucus elections for their next, when they picked the leader of their party, they voted 93-91 not to do it yet, but came pretty close. And so there's a conversation going there for those who follow the whole Speaker of the House, vote and vote again and vote again and vote again, vote again. There's thoughts about, well, maybe by the 3rd vote, you should use ranked choice voting and just get it done. So there's conversations going on there. And I just the general feeling, I think we can say, in all honesty, that this has become the fastest growing electoral reform in the country that can be appealing to both Republicans and Democrats. And we're seeing progress on both sides, from both kind of conservative areas and more liberal areas. And we've got a lot of work to do, but it feels like something that we can make essentially ubiquitous in the United States. Like, where our goal is to essentially rethink voting as ranking. And I think we had a good year toward that last year.
Well, and of course, the important thing, again, we've been discussing grassroots. Members of our audience might decide they'd like to get involved or help in some way. And so many people just feel, I have to say, helpless in politics. So in other words, if someone wanted to get involved, what can they do? How can they help?
Well, the simple suggestion is to just check out fairvoteaction.org, both to see how people can get involved with our work, but also with all the state and local groups. We sort of have a collective goal in the ranked choice voting community among state and local groups working with Fair Vote. And there's another national group called Rank the Vote that we work with on this to say, let's go from 60 cities using this to 500. Like, let's think big. We already have the biggest city in 7 states having passed ranked choice voting. Let's take that to 20. Let's keep building support. And that's a really good level of getting involved for someone. There's also more interim steps. We've had college students sort of mostly on their own initiative bring ranked choice voting to their campus for student elections, and almost 100 colleges and universities now use it for student leaders, and a whole mix of schools, Louisiana State University and Boise State and Stanford, and, like kind of a whole mix. Mm-hmm. And that can be a conversation, elsewhere too. And it is something that just saying, when people are kind of talking down about politics, and almost those that one-on-one opportunity we all have, we're in a conversation where people are being depressed about politics, say, well, there's an area of hope. There's a chance for change. And that's where I think ranked choice voting can fit in. So we all can do that when we're talking to people. And
So what about
and make it
seniors,
real.
for example, who might want to get involved but aren't as mobile? I mean, is there something for just about everyone to do that can help, even
Yeah,
if
absolutely.
donating, obviously, but donations aside, is there anything, people can do in general who might say, I'm limited to what I can do, but I want to help?
Yeah, well, I would say this, which is that donations certainly matter, and we're a nonprofit, as are our partner groups, trying to benefit from people's generosity. But it is like a lot of us are parts of some organization or association that might have a vote on something. You can talk to them about bringing ranked choice voting in, and certainly. Since so much activism these days is without going in person to things, one can, get on a list and then, write a letter to the city council or the state legislature, and particularly at the local level, our elected officials don't hear from people that much. So if they hear from them about this in a place where it's relevant, that actually matters quite a bit. So
that gets back to the grassroots. That makes a great deal of sense. You don't necessarily need to do something nationally if you can get it started locally.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's where we're hoping to get these sort of conversations toward the 500 cities in as many states as possible. So, yeah.
Well, Rob, I want to thank you very much for being with us. What you've had to say is not only informative, you've been very enlightening. I think people have a better understanding of ranked choice voting now than they did before. I mean, it's something that may be a little before, the way you've been able to explain things might be a little confusing, but I think it gives people more of a choice. I think we want to leave them with that thought. Am I correct?
More of a choice. And if they can count to 3, I think they're going to like ranked choice voting, right? So that's which I think our audience can, and realize that every new number you put down creates another relationship with a candidate, and creates a new opportunity to make your vote count. And as easy as 1, 2, 3.
Wonderful. And of course, we're going to have your information on our website, which we're going to get into in just a minute. But Rob, thank you again for joining us. Very helpful.
Thank you, James. Great interview, and enjoyed it.
Want to discover more information about Fair Vote and how you can get involved? It's really simple. Visit our website, jamespolakof.com. That's James, Polakof.com. You'll also discover a variety of valuable resources on our website and other terrific New Horizons for America podcast episodes. Again, jamespolakof.com. Now back to Dr. Jim.
I can assure you that it's definitely worth your time to learn more about the process of voting the fair way. Ranked choice voting here in America, I think, can make a big difference. All you really need to do is go to their website, fairvote.org. Or you can come directly to jamespolakof.com, where we have a number of Fair Vote links, and you can also access some of our great podcasts that you may have missed. It may be worth your while. In fact, I can assure you it will be. Once again, I want to thank my audience. You've been very loyal for following podcast after podcast. And again, I want to remind the new members that we have a podcast dropping every week. So please stay tuned. This is Dr. Jim Polakof. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time around.